In 1992, at the height of one of the worst environmental catastrophes the world had ever witnessed, a mayor and a handful of local engineers approached the edge of a dying sea carrying nothing more than dump trucks loaded with sand. Their plan sounded almost too simple to work: throw up a dirt wall across a 13-kilometer strait that had been letting billions of cubic meters of water pour out into the desert only to vanish into thin air. No concrete, no steel, nothing but sand, soil, and rows of stacked sandbags laid across open water. Scientists brushed it off. Officials back in the capital called it a waste of time. And the wider world had already given up on the region entirely, convinced it was beyond saving. And honestly, looking at the raw numbers, it was hard to disagree with them. This was the Aral Sea, once the fourth largest body of water on Earth. By the time those trucks arrived, it had already lost 90% of its water. Fishing boats sat rusting in open sand, stranded 100 kilometers from where the shoreline used to be. The fish had disappeared. The economy had collapsed. Towns were being abandoned one by one. And in the middle of all that, here were these men, showing up armed with nothing but shovels. But that rough makeshift sand wall ended up doing something nobody saw coming. Water started rising. Salt levels started falling. And for a short stretch of years, life crept back into a place everyone had already given up on. Then in 1999, a spring flood tore the whole thing apart. The wall gave way, 2 men lost their lives, and the water rushed straight back out into the void. By all rights, that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Because that failed pile of sand had proven something $100 million in consultants had completely missed, this sea wanted to come back. It just needed a wall that could actually hold. Today, the water in the North Aral Sea is rising again. The salt is being flushed out, fish are spawning, and the shoreline is slowly creeping back toward a town that hadn't seen water in decades. To understand why that wall mattered so much, you first need to understand what killed the Aral Sea in the first place. And the answer isn't complicated at all. Somebody turned off the tap. Starting in the 1950s, the Soviet government decided Central Asia was going to become a cotton powerhouse. Not just some cotton, all the cotton they could grow. They called it white gold and wanted the USSR to be fully self-sufficient in it. The catch was that cotton needs huge amounts of water, and Central Asia is a desert. So Soviet engineers did what they always did. They built on a massive scale. Over 30,000 kilometers of canals, 45 dams, 80 reservoirs. They rerouted 2 major rivers, the Sur Darya and the Amu Darya, away from the Aral Sea and straight into the cotton fields. The trouble was, the canals were badly built. Most were just ditches cut into loose sand with no lining and no covering. Water seeped out the sides and evaporated off the top long before it ever reached a crop. Somewhere between 1/4 and 3/4 of every drop that entered those canals never made it to a field at all. It simply disappeared into the ground or into the air. The Aral Sea used to receive roughly 56 billion cubic meters of fresh water a year from those 2 rivers. By the 1980s, during dry years, that inflow had dropped to almost nothing. The math was brutal and simple. More water was evaporating off the lake than was flowing into it, and that gap widened every single year. That's when the system began to trap itself in a vicious cycle. As the lake shrank, it grew shallower. Shallow water heats up faster in the sun, which speeds up evaporation, which shrinks the lake further, which makes it shallower still. It was a feedback loop that kept accelerating year after year. The salt content climbed right along with it. By the late 90s, the southern basin had reached 100 grams of salt per liter, 10 times its natural level and saltier than the ocean itself. Nothing could survive in water like that. In 1987, the water level fell so low that the sea actually split into 2 separate bodies. A narrow passage called the Berg Strait had been the last link between the northern and southern halves. Once the water dropped below that channel, you were left with 2 distinct lakes, the smaller Aral in the north sitting inside Kazakhstan and the much larger Aral in the south inside Uzbekistan. Then came the dust. The exposed lake bed, more than 60,000 square kilometers of it, turned into a brand new desert that people started calling the Aralsk. But this wasn't ordinary sand. This was the floor of a lake that had spent decades absorbing agricultural runoff. Pesticides, fertilizers, heavy metals, all of it baked into a crust of salt and poison. And when the wind kicked up, which it did roughly 10 times a year in major storms, it lifted that toxic crust straight into the atmosphere. Somewhere between 14 and 27 million tons of poison dust got thrown across the region every single year, with traces of it turning up as far away as the Arctic and the Himalayas. People living near the former sea breathed that dust in every day. Respiratory illness rates shot up. In some districts, infant mortality hit 72 deaths per 1,000 live births, among the highest anywhere in the former Soviet Union. The Aral Sea wasn't just dying, it was poisoning everything around it on its way out. Here's the thing nobody in Moscow or Almaty seemed to grasp, but that a local mayor named Tannerbergen Darmanov and a handful of regional engineers figured out on their own. The North Aral and the South Aral were two completely different problems. The south was vast, shallow, and fed by a river that Uzbekistan's cotton industry had already drained almost dry. That was really a political problem wearing an environmental disguise, and no amount of engineering was going to fix it. But the north still had the Sur Darya flowing into it. The river had been weakened by upstream dams and irrigation, sure, but it was still delivering water. The real problem was that every drop entering the North Aral drained straight south through the Berg Strait, spreading out across the shallow southern basin and evaporating into nothing. The North Aral was basically a bathtub with the drain left wide open, the faucet was running, water was coming in, but it was all pouring straight back out the bottom. Darmanov's idea, the one that got him laughed out of meetings, was simple. Plug the drain. Seal off the Berg Strait and keep the Sur Darya's water contained in the north, where the basin was deeper and the surface area smaller, so the water could actually build up instead of spreading thin and cooking off in the sun. That first sand dike in 1992 was crude, but it worked. Water levels rose, salinity dropped, fish began showing up. For a few years, it genuinely looked like the crazy idea was going to hold. Then the 1999 flood wrecked the whole structure, killed 2 workers, and sent years of progress pouring back into the southern desert. But here's the detail the skeptics missed. The sand dike's failure wasn't a failure of the idea. It was a failure of the materials. The concept was sound. The physics checked out. The wall just needed to be built the right way. That proof of concept, paid for in sand and blood, is exactly what convinced the World Bank and the Kazakh government to finally back a real structure with real money. In 2001, they committed $86 million to the Sur Darya Control and Northern Aral Sea project. At the heart of it was a permanent barrier across the Berg Strait, the Kokaral Dam. The Kokaral Dam runs 13 kilometers long, built from earthfill reinforced with concrete, and it was finished in August 2005. It works on a principle so basic it almost sounds too simple to be true. It's essentially a one-way valve. It holds the Sur Darya's inflow inside the northern basin, which is deeper and has a much smaller surface area than the south. By concentrating the water into a tighter, deeper space, you dramatically cut down the surface exposed to sun and wind. Less exposed surface means less evaporation, and less evaporation means the water level actually climbs. Think of it like pouring a glass of water onto a wide, flat baking sheet. It'll evaporate in hours. Pour that same glass into a tall, narrow cup, and it'll last for days. The dam essentially turned the North Aral from a baking sheet into a cup. And the engineers weren't careless about it this time. They'd learned from the 1999 disaster. The Kokaral Dam includes a 9-gate spillway capable of releasing up to 600 cubic meters of water per second. When the Sur Darya swells during spring snowmelt, the gates open and let the excess flow safely into the southern basin, preventing the dam from being overwhelmed and destroyed the way the sand dike was. That spillway does double duty too. Every time the gates open, they also flush out accumulated salt from the northern basin, helping keep the water chemistry balanced. The project didn't stop at the dam itself. The World Bank loan also paid for repairs to the Sardaria's channel and to upstream infrastructure, making sure more of the river's water actually reached the sea instead of leaking away through failing canals along the route. The dam was the headline, but the plumbing behind it mattered just as much. Scientists had predicted it would take 3 to 5 years for the North Aral to reach its target water level of 42 meters. They were wrong. It took 7 months. By early 2006, the water had already risen 11 feet, blowing past every projection. The shoreline, which had once retreated 100 kilometers from Aralsk, came surging back until it was just 25 kilometers from the city. And then the biology took over. This is really where the story becomes remarkable, because the engineers never stocked a single fish, never planted a single reed, never introduced a single species. All they did was change the water. Nature handled the rest. Before the dam, the North Aral salinity sat around 30 grams per liter, roughly the same as the ocean. The only fish that could handle that was the black sea flounder, a species that had been deliberately introduced because of its high salt tolerance. Everything else had disappeared. After the dam went in, as fresh water from the Sardaria poured in and salt got flushed out through the spillway, salinity dropped fast. Within a few years, it had fallen to 8 grams per liter. Almost exactly what the Aral Sea's natural salinity had been before 1960. That number, 8 grams per liter, turns out to be the critical threshold. Below 10 grams per liter, native species like pike perch, brame, and carp can actually spawn. Their eggs can tolerate the salt. Above that line, the eggs fail and the larvae die, no matter how many adult fish you introduce. The dam didn't just bring the water back, it brought the chemistry back, and the chemistry brought the fish back with it. 22 species returned entirely on their own, migrating out of the Sardaria Delta, where they'd been barely hanging on in the last remaining pockets of fresh water. Pike perch, the most commercially valuable of them, went from practically extinct in the open sea to the dominant catch. Bream, carp, roach, asp, all of them came flooding back into habitat that had been off limits for decades. Meanwhile, the flounder, the last survivor of the salty years, started to decline, now a saltwater fish stuck in an increasingly freshwater world and getting outcompeted by the natives. The fish brought the birds. Reeds began sprouting along the new shoreline, and white pelicans started circling over water that had been a dry salt flat just 5 years earlier. More than 300 species now use the restored delta for nesting and migration. On land, the return of water and vegetation brought back wild boar, wolves, and even the critically endangered saiga antelope. The reed beds formed a natural buffer that trapped moisture and blocked the toxic dust storms that had been battering the region for decades. Even the local climate started to soften. Humidity ticked up, and dust storms near the northern shore became noticeably less frequent. One wall, one change to the plumbing, and the entire ecosystem rebooted itself. Stand at the edge of the Kokaral Dam today, and you can actually see the dividing line. On the north side, blue-green water. Wind rippled, alive, pelicans circling overhead, fishing boats leaving wakes behind them. On the south side, a cracked white plain stretching to the horizon, nothing but salt crust and silence. Two entirely different worlds, separated by 13 kilometers of earth and concrete. The numbers tell the story better than any description could. The water level in the North Aral has risen 12 meters from its lowest point. The volume of water has nearly doubled, climbing from about 14 billion cubic meters to more than 27 billion. Salinity has dropped from 30 grams per liter down to somewhere between 8 and 10, a 73% reduction. The surface area has grown by over 600 square kilometers, meaning 600 square kilometers of what used to be toxic desert are now underwater again. The fishing industry has gone from 0 to 8,000 tons of annual catch, from 0 processing plants to 12, from fewer than 500 fishermen to more than 3,000. In the village of Tastubek, the number of houses has tripled. Young families who had left for cities like Almaty are actually moving back, a reverse migration that's almost unheard of in rural Central Asia, where the trend has always run the other way. The fish coming out of the North Aral today aren't just feeding local markets anymore. Pike perch is being exported to Russia, the European Union, and China. The Aral Fresh Fish Processing Plant in Aralsk is now certified for international export. A town that was choking on toxic dust 20 years ago is now shipping fish to restaurants in Europe. And they're not stopping there. Kazakhstan has already launched Phase 2 of the project. The plan is to raise the Kokaral Dam by another 2 meters, pushing the target water level from 42 meters up to 44. That would push the sea's total volume from 27 billion cubic meters to 34 billion, and expand the surface area to nearly 4,000 square kilometers. If the projections hold, the sea will reach the old harbor walls of Aralsk itself for the first time in decades. To get there, the government has launched 167 separate engineering projects to modernize irrigation along the entire length of the Surdarya. Concrete lining for canals that have been leaking into the sand for 50 years, automated monitoring stations tracking every cubic meter of flow, and subsidies to convert over 1 million hectares of farmland to drip and sprinkler irrigation. The goal is to save 500 million cubic meters of water every year, water that's currently being wasted, and redirect it straight into the sea. The South Aral, on the other side of that dam, tells a completely different story. Uzbekistan's economy is still built on cotton. The Amu Darya still runs dry long before it reaches the southern basin. In 2014, the eastern half of the South Aral evaporated completely, and where a sea once stood, Uzbekistan is now drilling for natural gas. The contrast between north and south is the clearest possible illustration of what happens when you fight the physics versus when you surrender to it. The Aral Sea will never return to what it looked like in 1960. 68,000 square kilometers of water is gone, and most of it isn't coming back. But the North Aral proves something more important than the size of the lake. It proves that a system everyone had written off as permanently dead can be restarted, if you intervene the right way at the right point. The Kokaral Dam isn't some miracle of technology. It's a 13-kilometer wall that does exactly one thing. It keeps water contained in a deep bowl instead of letting it spread across a shallow desert and evaporate away. The engineering is simple. The physics is simple. Concentrate your resource where it does the most good and stop wasting it where it does the least. Gravity and geometry took care of the rest. Sometimes the most powerful piece of engineering isn't the most complicated one. Sometimes it's just a wall, built in the right place. If the mechanics of reviving broken landscapes interest you, subscribe. There are deserts being held back by straw, wastelands turned around by orange peels, and dead zones rebuilt from nothing but holes in the ground. The engineering behind each of those stories is every bit as satisfying as this one.